Hey, welcome everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, who I met in recent months as she was completing her work for her master's degree. And Elena, if you can advance to the next slide. So as the slide indicates, Valerie is from the Northern Illinois region. She has been a facilitator for Growing Up Wild since 2013. She recently completed her Master's of Education in Natural Science and Environmental Education, and she has a professional background in non-formal education. And Valerie, I believe you are about to take a job as a classroom teacher. Can you tell me again what grade you'll be teaching?
I will be teaching 3rd to 8th grade science at a charter school in Rockford.
Great, all
Quite the
right.
age range.
Well, congratulations on that. And having said all that, we can go on to the next slide, and Valerie, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. Excuse me. Thank you again for allowing me the opportunity to present some of the research and work that I did while I was completing my master's. The slide that you are looking at right now is the research question that I used within my master's, but before I delve into that, I just wanted to quickly give a few statistics on autism and the autism spectrum disorder with regards to children. In 2018, the CDC estimated that 1 in 59 children is diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and that's broken down into 1 in 37, 37 boys, and then 1 in 151 girls. The average age of diagnosis is 4 years old, but skilled practitioners can diagnose as young as 2 years old. A third of the autism spectrum population is nonverbal, and 31% of children have intellectual disabilities that coincide with autism. Nearly half of those children with ASD, are wanderers or will bolt with really no warning. 28% can exhibit self-harm behaviors. Up to a third may have epilepsy, and 30 to 60% of children with autism spectrum disorder display symptoms of ADD or ADHD. So obviously, that was a quick rundown of autism symptoms and what can be presented. I specifically pulled those out with regards to what non-formal educators can see predominantly out in the field and what would need to be best planned for. Seeing a lot of, to see more students in the field with us when they have ADHD coupled with autism spectrum. So going into the research question that I had was, what were the best ways to modify the Growing Up Wild curriculum to best support young learners with autism spectrum? With inclusion being very predominant in schools, you're seeing a lot of integration with students with disabilities in classrooms. You're not seeing just classrooms devoted to children with special needs so much anymore. There is a big push for integration. So I wanted to look at, instead of creating a separate document, a separate curriculum on how non-formal educators can educate students with ASD and other special needs, how can we tweak or modify our existing programming that is really, really good that we already have? So what can we put in place to support those children with ASD using our own curriculum that we have already? So we can go to the next slide, please. So bringing those two worlds together, bringing children with ASD and non-formal education, in this case, Growing Up Wild, together. Again, ASD causes social, communication, and behavioral challenges within their population. We know nature can positively affect the domains that ASD presents, just the statistics that I had gone over. So the unique challenge, though, is how are we going to include children with autism, or really any disability, into our programming that is designed to utilize multisensory approaches? Especially with Growing Up Wild, we know that young children learn best by doing. We know that's everybody, but young children especially, it's whole body learning. So how are we to encourage a classroom full of diverse learners literally getting their hands dirty when there are some serious sensory issues, or there's children that are going to run, there are children that have seizures, and you're doing a pond study and they're around water? What are some of those parameters we can put in place to help address those situations? We can go to the next slide, please. This slide and the next slide are just two screenshots that I took from obviously the Growing Up Wild guide that I used within my thesis. And my thesis looked at adapting or modifying the Take Me Outside activities. So obviously, thank you, within the next slide, you can implement, if someone wants to take this further, you can certainly apply the principles to other sections, the centers and extensions, especially the art projects, the music and movement sections. You can apply modifications to that, but my project and thesis looked at modifying the Take Me Outside section. So we can go to the next slide, and you'll see this is just the example, a zoomed in screenshot of the other example. So just as a kind of think to yourself scenario, you have a group of young kiddos coming out to your site, and let's say they're a first grade class. When the kids get off the bus, the teacher mentions there are a couple students with autism who have varying abilities. One student is sensitive to touch and has limited communication skills. The other has mobility constraints and uses a walker on uneven ground. I know in my career, I've been presented with this surprise information when we're going out for a lengthy hike, and I'm just now getting this information, like, what am I going to do now? How am I going to modify my program to make everyone, to make the entire group inclusive and successful in the programming? So that's what I had seen personally, and I had noted as an area that outdoor education, non-formal education can use resources for. Classroom teachers, they're great with their students in the classroom, but they bring them to us for a reason as non-formal educators and outdoor educators. We are our experts. We are the experts in our field, so we need to be inclusive of entire classrooms that are coming out, and we are seeing much more diverse classrooms now. All right, we can go ahead to the next slide, please. So again, what I did was, in my project, I offered modifications for the 27 Take Me Outside activities. And I identified what I called activity elements. And those were mobility, fine motor skills, receptive and expressive communication, visual, auditory, sensory, and social. So those modifications for the activity elements would be identified at the top of each activity. So not every Take Me Outside activity is going to have all of those 8 modifications, but it would be at least one of the 8 identified, and then you would be able to see the suggestions for modifications based off of what was identified. So if we go to the next slide, it will show an example of that. So again, just taking the fishing fun activity, and with the fish tag, the yellow highlighting shows the following elements. So it shows mobility. So that activity offers mobility elements, visual and auditory elements, and sensory elements as well. So play a game, obviously that corresponds to mobility. Standing or touching can be mobility and sensory, etc. All right, we can go to the next slide, please. And then this is this slide and the next 2 slides just show just screenshots of the document that offers all of those modifications for those 8 activity elements. So for mobility, the possible modifications, depending on what the child is exhibiting, I could implement other movements such as skipping. They could walk instead of run, sliding or shuffling. We can make sure that the activity is kept on flat ground. It could be on a hard surface. So instead of playing in the grass, we might be playing on blacktop or a large unused portion of a pavement. We can offer transportation to and from the activity's location if we have to hike kind of far. We can designate a specific role for that child within the game. So a student, instead of running, they could be the referee. They could be the data recorder or the biologist to see how many fish were caught. All right, we can go to the next slide, please. Other possible modifications within that activity that offers visual and auditory elements. You can see the list there. And again, there is a document that does offer the entire modifications for those 8 activity elements. So don't feel like you have to screenshot or write everything down. That document is made available for you too. But the document was just too long to, the multi-page document was too long to put into slides. So I just picked out a few based off of an activity. So again, visual, you can offer visual boundaries for the activities, written instructions, or have communication or picture cards that explains the activity. For auditory, you can demonstrate various roles within the game instead of just verbally saying the instructions for the game. You can repeat those directions, physically demonstrate them, and make sure that you're intentional in your positioning of where you are in relation to that child, and make sure that they are very close to you. All right, and go to our last one. And this one with sensory is, sensory and mobility are 2 of the biggest ones that I have encountered with modifications. But sensory is, again, with being a big one, that is really using your imagination and what you can possibly think of to integrate. You could use a tag stick. And actually a lot of schools, when they do play tag in PE classes, they're not using a hand motion to tag anymore. They're using about 6 or 8 inch sections of pool noodles that they use as tag sticks. So that can help alleviate the person-to-person contact if a child is not accustomed to that or does not like to be touched by someone. You can use a tag stick. as an alternative. You can have them stand next to a safe spot instead of touching it like the game intended. Instead of putting their hands on something, they can stand next to it. That would be okay. And a big one in our bag of tricks, to keep hand sanitizer or wipes on hand if hands get dirty and that causes a problem. So obviously there's no place to wash your hands outside. So having that available can help alleviate any possible situations that may arise. All right, we can go to the next slide. There's also a document that has been made available that I had included in my thesis, called the Individualized Student Profile for Outdoor Learning. And this document is made to be very intentional with communication to the schools that non-formal educators have come out to their sites. So modifications that we made in that previous fish tag activity, instead of having to do those on the fly when the teacher gets off the bus or we go into a classroom, if we're doing an in-school, and we're now presented at the last minute with these modifications or these abilities that we need to accommodate, we can use this individualized profile as a communication tool with the classroom teacher. So we can try to head off any of those questions ahead of time instead of on site. So I had developed that as a tool to ensure successful inclusion in outdoor ed programming. Again, it's trying to be very intentional, and you can use the questions when you see a copy of it later. You can use those as guiding questions to inform your current programming, and also you can use it as future programming if you're even doing any public programming as well. So it's made to be a very universal document that people can modify to their sites. All right, we can go to the next slide, please. As I'm getting to the last two slides here, again, it's being just some takeaways on program modifications. Your participation is going to vary. I have done programming where a student is nonverbal and he was a runner, and this was at a residential education facility. So he was with us for 2 days, or for 2.5 days, and we're doing night hikes, and we want him to participate, but you can't force the level of participation. So participation will vary, and that is okay. The goal is we're working hard to achieve the same goal, but how we get there may look a little different. So success will look different, and again, that's okay. Just getting them, we need to go back to those foundational tenets of the benefits of nature education is just being exposed to nature is doing good. So that we do need to, remember when we are programming for students that do have disabilities. And our last slide we can go to. Again, just our ending slide, and if there's any questions, I'd be more than happy to try and answer your questions. This is a quote that I used in my thesis, and it was really one of those, it was one of the first things that I found as I started, and I really took that to heart and have always believed in this, and will continue to do it as I cross over into formal education. So we really need to be intentional and diverse in how we differentiate our instructing techniques to a wide range of audiences. All right, That's all I have. Mark, I don't know if you wanted to go over the other ones or you wanted me to. So
Sure. Yes, yes, I'll share with you all in just a moment how to access um, some of the documents that were referred to, including the document with the individualized student profile. There was a question from Elena, Valerie, and that is, did you create the individual modification sheet or did it come from another source?
I did put that together. That was in conjunction with my reviewers. I did have a reviewer. Two of my reviewers worked for a local organization that I had previously worked with, and we worked very close together. One was in the therapeutic recreation department, and her and I worked very close together in supporting diverse needs. So it was the collaboration between her and I in past practices and what we've done, and what I had utilized overseeing nature camps and the residential education programming.
Great, okay. This would be a good time to go to the next slide. And of course, if there are other questions, keep them coming. So this is a look at a few of the pages from the individualized student profile for outdoor learning. And as Valerie had told me previously, this tool can be modified. Can you speak to that for a moment, Valerie?
Absolutely. This is something that came directly, I copied and pasted directly out of my thesis. And these were the activity elements, or excuse me, not the activity elements. These were the different categories that I briefly spoke about in being very intentional and asking our teachers questioning about the programming before they come out. So any students that have any sort of, you can copy it off, you can give it, just email it to your teachers, have them fill it out. It could be, not applicable, or if there are any needs that need to be discussed, this is a great tool to use. And this is not ASD specific necessarily. There are questions on here that are, that kind of guide, to students with autism spectrum, but it is universally designed enough that if you just have a kid who's a wanderer, that's it, or a kid who takes medication, that's on here. Those questions are on here as well too.
Okay, and Elena, can you go to the next slide? So this is a look at a page I hope you all have seen before. It's one of the resource pages for Project Wild. And next slide. Down towards the bottom of this document is where we have resources for inclusion. Next slide. Which, yeah, so there's a blow up of what that looks like. And then the next slide, please. And you can see the last, and then the next slide. The last three bullets here are the new items. Yes, and go ahead one more, please. There we go. So these three are the ones that were just added to this list. These are accessible by the public, so anyone coming to this Project Wild resources pages can access these. And you'll see that if you do access them, that they are credited towards Valerie and used with permission. And thank you, Valerie, for that permission. And we
You're
hope
welcome.
that Project Wild coordinators can share them with their facilitators and facilitators with their educators to help meet the needs of learners with special needs. Okay, and I think that's all here. And Elena, if you could go on to the next slide, just make sure that I don't have any more in there. Yeah, okay, so before we go on, were there any more questions for Valerie before Valerie signs off? Okay.
Actually, I have a question, Mark. This is Elena again. Obviously, Project Wild, the activities we have are written for a very general audience. Certainly we have an interest in getting all students outdoors and engaged with nature and environmental activities. Valerie, how, in your experience, how easy or not easy is it to modify these kinds of activities? And that, that we also, there's also Project WET, Project Learning Tree, and I'm sure there's a ton of other curriculum that is not written with, special learning needs in mind at all. So I'm assuming that educators really have to spend a lot of time to amend activities and lessons.
That is true. That's actually one of the reasons why I wanted to pursue this as a project. And I used Growing Up Wild because just as me being a facilitator with that, I'm most knowledgeable about that resource. But what I also did is when I made those, like the activity modifications, I tried to make it, even though I was using the Growing Up Wild curriculum, I tried to make it so it was broad enough that you could apply it to Project WET, Project Wild, Flying Wild, any of the other Learning Tree, any of the other projects that that are available. So you could use, you could take that document and look at ideas for modifications for mobility. So even though I use the Growing Up Wild curriculum to highlight those modifications, but ideally you would be able to take those 8, that document that has the listing of the 8 modifications and apply those to other project guides. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't just really taking, because a first thought was taking each activity and modifying the activity for itself. That came up as a limiting factor in a conversation I had with my thesis professor. The goal was to make it as widely accessible as possible. And if I just showed modifications for those 27 Take Me Outside activities, then it became an isolated standalone modifications just for that. Then if someone else wanted to do that with the other ones, then you have half a dozen of other project guides that you would need to offer modifications for. So hopefully this was just a springboard to start that conversation, and also make it so you don't need we don't need 2 Growing Up Wild guides. The guides are time tested and awesome in what they are and what they offer. So you don't need one with that offers just modifications for students with disabilities, because the disabilities range so much. So I tried to make it as universally designed as possible to use with any of the other guides as well.
Well, thank you. So I really do appreciate this resource, because it's, we certainly want to be inclusive, and like I said, we want all kids to be able to enjoy the outdoors and learn about the place in which they live. And I think sometimes, if I were doing a program with children that have special learning needs, I would be really nervous about how to approach that. But I think this at least gives us a strategy to work closely with the educator to make sure that we do provide those kids with a valuable experience.
And Valerie, I want to thank you again.
Thank
it's
you
really
very much.
generous of you to share your resources, and I know you're about to sign off, so we'll move on to our next portion.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Bye-bye.